Sorry about that, everyone. I'm back. I just want to go over our agenda for today. I'm going to be the moderator for this session, and we'll go over what to expect, some team introductions, and open the chat with some Q&A. In terms of how to engage, you want to use the Q&A box over in the the right-hand corner. And then once questions appear and they're approved, they'll be published, and our experts will answer them verbally. And just a quick reminder that this session will be recorded. Please adhere to the Microsoft Code of Conduct. We want to create a safe and respectful environment for all our build participants. So now I'm going to hand it over to Bob Ward, Principal Architect for Azure Data and all things SQL Server, to go through the rest of our team introductions and kick us off. Take it away, Bob.
Mila, thank you. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us today. Wow, what a session we just did. The excitement that we've already heard about our announcements for SQL Server 2022 public preview, for Synapse Link for SQL, for Azure SQL Database, for Microsoft Purview dynamic lineage, all the things we just did. Boy, we've just been flooded with people that are very excited about what's happening today with SQL all up. I'd like to quickly introduce our other on-camera experts who are going to be part of our question and answer today, and then just get right to your questions. So first you saw demonstrating Synapse Link was Chuck Heinzelman. Hey, Chuck, how's it going?
All right, happy to be here, Bob. Thank you very much. I am a Principal PM Manager on the Azure SQL DB team, representing Synapse Link for SQL.
Thanks, Chuck. And next, Drew Squire Kabbalah. Drew, that was a pretty amazing demo you did showing end-to-end development experiences across all of Azure SQL Database.
Yeah, this is such a fantastic and exciting day for developers, Bob. I mean, Microsoft built, but then for Azure SQL, one of these premier database platforms, to bring all these features for developers is just, I mean, it doesn't get any better than what we're able to cram into a single demo. So really excited to be here and talk to folks and answer questions. I'm a PM that works on SQL tools, and I generally focus on developer experiences. So this is just pretty cool to see.
Oh, thanks so much, Drew. Sunetra Verdi, Sunetra, I meant it when I said it in the session. Every time I see your demo on Lineage, I just should do it on my code, man. It's awesome.
Thank you so much, Bob. Happy to be here. And I hope everybody is enjoying the sessions. I am Sunetra Verdi, Senior PM on Azure Purview, and happy to answer questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Sunetra. You know, Mila, we got other experts off camera right now also answering questions online, but let me turn it back to you. We want to make sure we take the rest of today's session to answer all those great questions that are coming about what we just announced today at Microsoft Build.
Yes, thank you, Bob. It looks like we already have some questions getting fired up here in the Q&A chat. And the first one here, I'm going to kick it off to Drew here. Any plans to open source DeckFX?
Yeah, this is a great question, because DeckFX, if you're not familiar with it, is a library that can be used to manage your SQL development in a way that is kind of unparalleled for developers. So you can take your database as code and publish it once or many times. And these kinds of developer tools are great when they're open source, because then more developers can collaborate their ideas to it. DeckFX itself, we don't have an immediate plan that I can say, hey, I think we have this date to get it open sourced. But as you look across our SQL tools and libraries, you're seeing a lot of them are either starting open source or going open source. SQL Management Objects recently went open source. So it's safe to say that we are working to get DeckFX open source, but I don't have a date to share with you on that.
Okay, thank you, Drew. And then I'm going to take this next question. Why Microsoft discontinued SQL Server BDC or Big Data Clusters, and what's new in SQL Server 22 in this regards? Bob, are you able to answer that question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mio, for asking that. So I know that a lot of folks were a little bit disappointed that we made the decision to retire Big Data Clusters, but it was just simply an acknowledgement from us about trends in the industry, things that are going on with analytics. So I'm going to make a comment. I'd like to turn over to Chuck to make some additional comments because Chuck does spend a time in this space and owns our strategy around analytics for operational databases. But even with that retirement, though, we do have analytics solutions. You've heard of data virtualization we've had in SQL Server 2022. Also let Chuck pound on that, and also Synapse Link. But just remember, the poly-based functionality, being able to get the data in sources where they exist and not move the data is a key part of our strategy. But Chuck, do you have any additional thoughts there?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. As you mentioned, poly-based still exists in SQL 2022. We don't have the scale-out container-based functionality that was BDC. But as you mentioned, the industry is changing. When we first designed that, a lot of things were based around Hadoop infrastructure and HDFS, and things have shifted since then. And we are going more toward a cloud hybrid environment where we have hardware vendors that are basically putting out appliances that are what you used to have to build with an HDFS cluster. So you're absolutely right. It's an acknowledgement that the industry is evolving, and we are following the industry. We are making sure that we are meeting the needs of the future, not just current. So look for things like the poly-based still existing and using those technologies to replace what was there in big data clusters. And of course, the hybrid operations between cloud and on-prem with Synapse Link, moving your data up to a massively parallel analytics platform, that just helps us along the way.
Perfect. Thanks, Chuck. Next question that's coming in here. Is there any support for application consistent backup on SQL for Linux?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one?
Yeah, is there any support for application consistent backup on SQL for Linux?
Oh, application consistent backup on Linux. So as you know, the SQL Server engine on Linux is completely compatible with SQL Server on Windows. So any backup you do of the actual database itself is all completely compatible. I can take a database and I can back it up on Linux and restore it to anywhere I want, right, in the SQL family. So there is a consistent story there. I don't know whether the questions around our new SQL snapshot back capability, that is an interesting concept and that's something that's great for Linux customers because they want to do snapshot backups in the past. They couldn't do that. So think about the ability to freeze I/O on your system, whether it's Linux or Windows, and then be able to take a snapshot or a file copy of your backups and then continue I/O after that process. So that actual feature in SQL Server 2022, one of the reasons we did that is to support snapshot backups across platforms, including Windows and Linux.
Perfect. Thanks, Bob. And Chuck, I had a question for you. I was curious, you're presenting Synapse Link for SQL for SQL Server 22 and Azure SQL Database. Is there a difference in configuring those, or is it just a different data source?
There is a slight difference in configuring them. With Azure SQL Database, in both situations, we use an integration runtime and a landing zone to communicate between the database and the Synapse Analytics platform. With Azure SQL Database, we manage that for you behind the scenes. You don't have to configure a storage account. You don't have to configure an IR. With the SQL Server 2022 implementation, you bring the storage account that's used for the landing zone, and you have to install the self-hosted integration runtime on-prem. That is the same integration runtime if you've used Azure Data Factory or used Synapse Pipelines. It's the same integration runtime that you would install for those. It's just we're also using it for Synapse Link for SQL.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then oh, it looks like this one's a popular one, Drew. SQL Server Managed Studio, is it going to have dark mode? I've been seeing this come up in the chat frequently.
I for one, am not at all surprised that this question came up. It is a very popular question, and I can be really kind of forthcoming and honest about this. SSMS, SQL Server Management Studio, is continuing to be invested in. There are further releases. There are SSMS 19s coming out. But when you think about a modern application and certain feature sets, I'm going to be honest that there's a gap between an application like SSMS that's been around for a long time and has a lot of different features in it, and something smaller like VS Code and Azure Data Studio, where it has been built from the ground up with support for themes. For SSMS, we focus, when we're looking at the dark mode story, around what can we do to make SSMS more accessible. So making sure that the screens are scaling correctly to 4K, making sure that that 3:1 minimal contrast or 4.5:1 minimal contrast in the different windows is really met, while also continuing to support these enterprise features around all those wizards and dialogues that incorporate to the friends of SQL, like your SSIS. All of those things need to be a part of the story, and we don't want to throw something out there that makes the product inaccessible to others. So I don't have a dark mode for you in SSMS, but I do have the commitment to building as many tools as we can for developers to be able to use in managing and developing for SQL, whether you're using SQL Server on-prem or one of the Azure SQL options.
Okay, thanks, Drew. Appreciate you letting everyone know what's happening there. So I have a question here. It's a little bit of a longer question, so it may take multiple experts. But I noticed there in the talk, there was mention of deploying SQL Server using a DeckFX, as well as the use of a local development environment. With use of an Azure SQL database, what is your recommendation flow for developers with automated deployments or development? Should we set up a SQL project? Anything I should keep in mind to keep this compatible with new local development functionality that you have coming out? So essentially, to summarize, it looks like they're asking if they should set up a new SQL project. Is there anything that they should do from a configuration perspective to make things compatible?
Yeah, that's a great question around development lifecycle for Azure SQL. A DAC the question was around, is a singular file format that encompasses an entire database schema. And when you're developing, when you're making your application or just working on your database schema, that beginning step is working with a SQL project. We really recently launched a preview for an SDK style SQL project, which is a really small, flexible file format that means that you can throw all your code into a folder or into a folder structure, and then that SQL project goes along for you on the ride for your CI/CD process for your entire application. We have a GitHub action for SQL that can either build your project file for you and then publish it, or if you've already built your SQL file and you just have that DAC to publish, you can do that right from GitHub. So maybe you're using an Azure SQL database with Azure Static Web Apps, or Azure Static Web Apps using GitHub for CI/CD. Take your database schema along for the ride. So you can, as far as recommendations with starting with SQL projects, you can start from the ground up, but you can also start a SQL project from an existing database. So you don't have to like worry, oh, I missed the boat there. No, you're good. You can start at any point, but I do recommend starting from SQL projects. The compatibility between Azure SQL database and then that local emulator stays the same. So if you're publishing to Azure SQL database, you can publish to that local emulator to do your local inner development loop, or if you're publishing to SQL Server 2022, there's going to be the ability to publish to local SQL Server 2022 when that container image is available.
Great, thank you, Drew. I'm going to change it up a little bit and talk a little bit about Microsoft Purview and SQL. Sunetra, we talked about dynamic lineage in the session. Can you tell me a little bit about how often Microsoft Purview scans and how often that lineage is updated?
Great question, Miva. So the lineage from Azure SQL is immediately recorded in X-event logs. However, Microsoft Purview scans the X-event logs every 6 hours. So any changes that are happening in your database in terms of lineage, they get reported into Purview with runtime metadata within 6-hour window.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a question here. I'm not sure if we can answer it due to, it mentions a third-party vendor, but I'll put it out there and see what happens. We have a third-party vendor that offers a cloud-based CRM product that has SQL as a backend. We have arranged for a log-shipped copy of our database. which is a little clunky to maintain. Would Synapse Link be able to replace that?
I think we can address that in generalities. Let's not take it to the specific third-party vendor or CRM vendor, but so it depends on what you're using the logship database for. If you are using log shipping to create an offline copy of that database that can be used for reporting and analytics, you absolutely could replace that with using Synapse Link for SQL to move the data into Azure Synapse instead of the on-prem database or the logship database. That is, if that is your use case in general, whether it's a third-party CRM or whatever the situation might be, that is a use case that would make sense for potentially looking at Azure Synapse Link for SQL.
Okay, and it looks like we have couple other Synapse Link questions here. To use Synapse Link to link on-premise SQL and Azure SQL Pool, we need self-hosted integration runtime. Will this be used from Volterra or it would be Windows on-prem?
So the self-hosted integration runtime runs on a Windows machine on-prem. Or someplace, doesn't have to be on-prem, it has to be someplace that can access those on-prem resources.
Okay, thanks, Chuck. And here's an interesting one for you, Bob. A lot of enterprise SQL servers have multiple databases with cross-database queries. Any plans for SQL Database to deal with this? I know Managed Instance does.
Yeah, thanks, Miwa. So right now today, no. Right now today, the idea of an Azure SQL database is that it's a contained database. There are ways to kind of fool the system to query from one database to another using like an external table concept inside Azure SQL database. But the intention of Azure SQL database is to make it just that. It's a single database that your application uses. If you need the ability for your app to access multiple databases, you would do that for the application itself, right? You would connect to each one and use per its needs. But if you're going to actually do it within SQL itself behind the scenes, that's where managed instance really comes into play in the PaaS scenario, because that's the idea. It's an instance of SQL that hosts multiple databases. So right now, from our perspective, Azure SQL Database really wanted to focus more on just that contained database experience, just from an application point of view.
Okay, thank you. And then here's a question here. Are there any plans to have Azure Synapse on Azure Arc?
I don't think we're in a position to talk about futures and roadmaps here.
Okay, sounds good. So it looks like those are our questions. So let's see. With 10 minutes left here, Bob, can you tell us more about if you missed the beginning of the session, the intelligent query processing, how it works, and how you can game performance with no code changes?
Yeah, thanks, Miwa, because I get a lot of questions about this, because that's kind of a bold statement, don't you think, to say that you can actually get performance with no code changes? My colleagues often question, Bob, can you really make such a bold statement? And where did built-in and query intelligence come from? Honestly, this is the idea. The query processor is super smart. It's been around for a long period of time inside the Microsoft SQL engine, which powers SQL Edge to Cloud, right? But we want to make it more intelligent to react to and adapt to any workload you have. So we started this journey in SQL 17 and in 19 and in Azure SQL Database to do this idea of intelligent query processing. And here's the thing. We literally took common customer scenarios. People just told us all the time, I struggle with memory grants. I struggle with table variables. I struggle with parameter sensitive plan, those kind of type things. We've taken these scenarios. We found ways to bake into the query processor code the ability to recognize queries that hit that scenario and literally just change them and fix them on the fly based on feedback. So you take this parameter sensitive plan problem, also no parameter sniffing. It's just us going into the code saying, look, we recognize the ability that we can cache multiple plans for a given stored procedure based on a known set of parameter values based on statistics, and just make the optimize smarter. So you all of a sudden now go to SQL 2022, you've got queries that hit these states. You go to DB compat mode, the latest one, 160, you didn't change your code. As you saw in our demonstrations, you got faster. But consider also the other demo we did called DOP feedback. This is a really interesting one. So customers struggle all the time with setting max DOP, right? For the server, for the instance, for the database, for queries. They get into a really, really complicated query tuning exercise to figure this out. So what if we could use the power of the query store and monitor your queries and adjust the DOP of a given query on the fly, adjust it on the fly, not recompile it, just adjust it, lower it, and then monitor its performance based on a feedback cycle, hence DOP feedback, and then keep monitoring to a point to where we achieve what we call stabilization. As you saw in the demonstration, that is, can I get to a point where that query performs pretty much like it did before, but lower the DOP feedback in a way that CPU overhead resources are greatly reduced. Therefore, that query runs like it kind of did before, but all the other queries in the system now run at a much better performance rate. So again, that's gaining performance with no code changes, because all you did is declare, I'd like to use that functionality with a database option, upgrading to SQL 2022, and you just get it. So we have more in this space we even want to do, and we're just continuing to build on the tradition of what we built in SQL 17, 19, and Azure SQL Database.
Okay, great, thank you. And then we have a question that came in here. What alternatives do we have for distributed tables with data pool with SQL Server on-prem?
So maybe you're thinking in terms of what we had in big data clusters, which was a data pool concept right inside the BDC idea. That was something we built in. So you still can achieve some of those same type of concepts with partitioning, if you want to use that inside SQL Server on premises. In fact, that's kind of what we did, if you think about it, in that concept inside BDC. So we were just using that whole partitioning concept. So that's possible. You can still do that kind of type concept today, even with SQL Server on premises using partitioning. You're certainly allowed to do that. The data pool was just something that we did inside a set of container images to kind of abstract that concept. So we still have that concept today. You can do it yourself using partitions and SQL Server.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bob. And then Drew, I'm going to hand over this one to you. DevOps pipelines or GitHub Actions ? For data projects?
So it's really a short question with a two-part answer. The first and most important part is, where are you already working? Now, I talk about a lot of forward-looking things, especially today, but the reality is that we want to keep our tooling to be compatible. So if you're working with SQL projects, you can use Azure DevOps Pipelines or GitHub Actions. If you've already done a lot of work in Azure DevOps, if you already have your Key Vault integrated to pull your secrets in, you don't have to pick up and move to GitHub Actions just because Drew is talking about it in Microsoft Build. Now, if you are building an app that you've connected the CI/CD into GitHub Actions, by all means, run your database through there. So I don't have a delineated answer one way or the other. That said, I did mention this was a two-part answer, and the second part would be, if you're starting from scratch, my recommendation would be to go over to GitHub. You're going to get more rapid advancement if you're using your CI/CD through GitHub Actions.
Okay, thank you, Drew. Looks like we're getting some questions about Azure SQL Database Ledger. Bob, maybe you can give a quick recap of the announcement, and then a question here. Is there any connection between temporal tables and the new database ledger feature in SQL Server 2022?
It's a great way to actually summarize it, Miwa, to be honest with you, because as it turns out, updatable ledgers use temporal behind the scene a little bit. So if you think about a temporal table real quickly, we introduced that in SQL 16. The idea is that you could say and declare I want a temporal table. We would automatically record now history of changes you made inside the database by default, which had like a history table and a view on top of it. Ledger's a little different in the sense that we still can do that with an updatable ledger table, but now there's information about who made the change, there's times they made the change, and there's transaction ID concepts who made the change. That's tied into a crypto hash, hence a blockchain of what you did. You know, you kind of have almost like a checksum now. You make a change, we know who did it, we can track who did it, but you also have a checksum behind the scenes in case somebody tried to tamper with it. What you showed and we saw today in the announcement of general availability of Ledger for database, which is also available in public preview for SQL Server 2022, is a append-only ledger. That was a really interesting scenario, right? You got multiple parties in a supply chain. They need a centralized system, but not a central authority to trust the data. They all want to trust the data. So they use the concept of append-only, which you can't change the definition of once you make it append-only. Now you can only add records to what's going on in the system. Nobody can fudge the records. You've got the crypto hash behind the scenes. Now you have a concept of a digest. It's a checksum of a checksum. So everybody can store, we can store this digest in a trusted location we all trust. I'll take that digest at any time and compare it to the ledger and say, oh yeah, the data is valid. You saw in that case, in that demo, where we're all trying to validate where did the temperature compliance problem appear from? And all parties can now look at that and say, yeah, we trust it's up from that one shipping company. That's where we need to go fix the supply chain. So Azure SQL Database Ledger, that's generally available. It's in SQL Server 2022 now as well in public preview. Think of just about all the different vertical industry solutions we can now build using this technology. And we're just taking advantage of some technology we already had in SQL Server and building on top of that the idea of a blockchain inside the engine itself. It's pretty exciting stuff.
Okay, great. I'm just going to take one last question because it's popped up a couple times now. So it looks like someone wants to ask this question for Azure Purview. And it is asking about compliance with any energy-specific governance standards or really any vertical standards at this time. Sunitra, can you take that one?
Sure. So we are working on complying with multiple industry standards, and this is one specific, so which we will have more information on our documentation over a period of time, but not today. We don't comply with it today.
Okay, thanks, Sunitra. And then another question also that's popped up a couple times here, but not sure that we can give a timeline here, but timeline for new .SQL project format support in Visual Studio. Drew, are you able to speak to that at all?
I can tell you that I can't give you a timeline just yet. We are working towards that. That's been part of the announcement that, hey, the new SQL project format is fully supported, Azure Data Studio, VS Code, and then directly from the command line. But for that full Visual Studio experience, it's not quite there yet. You'd have to continue to use that previous SQL project format that everyone knows and loves.
Okay, great. Thank you, Drew. It looks like there aren't any additional questions coming in, and with a couple minutes here, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap this up. Just want to thank all our experts here that joined us today, as well as all of you submitting your questions. Please enjoy the rest of the sessions at Build, and we have tons of learning resources to continue your learning journey, and you'll see that throughout the event. Thank you, everyone.